We come now to the final 6 chapters of the book of Zechariah. When we began this study in Zechariah, I told you that I had divided this into 4 parts. I think it was 4 parts, 3 parts of the book, and then the introduction was the 4th. But I feel like I need to divide it further, and we're just going to look at 3 chapters in this lecture, chapters 9, 10, and 11, and save 12, 13, and 14 for one final lecture. There's just a lot of material in these 6 chapters. Chapters 1 to 8 referred to Zechariah's own time. The goal in view was encouragement for the rebuilding of the temple. Chapters 9 to 14, which form the second part or the last part of the book, deal chiefly with the future and were probably written a long time after the first 8 chapters were penned by Zechariah. Chapters 1 to 8 deal with the Israelites when they are under Medo-Persian rule. Chapters 9 and 10 when Israel is governed by Greece. Chapter 11 when she is under Roman dominion, and then chapters 12 to 14 when she shall be in the last days on earth. Okay, the millennial kingdom, a lot of it has to do with. In verses 1 to 8 of chapter 9, the campaign of Alexander the Great is sketched. Now, as I go through this, you're really going to need to follow along in your Bible, and you may have to pause me from time to time to look at the verse and then to listen to the commentary that I have to offer. But in Zechariah 9, verses 1 through 8, especially the beginning of this, the word of the Lord is against the land of Hadrach, will rest upon Damascus. In verse 2, upon Hamath, then Tyre and Sidon. A little bit more about Tyre. When we come to verse 5, we go into Philistine country, Ashkelon, Gaza, Ekron, Ashdod. And so we are looking really at the campaign of Alexander the Great. It's sketched out for us here. His successes are being recounted in the first 7 verses, and verse 8 notes then the deliverance of Jerusalem. Alexander quickly conquered Damascus. Remember, Damascus is to the north of Israel, of the promised land, and Sidon and Tyre. After 7 months, Tyre was burned. Then Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron. Those were Philistine cities. The course of his victories in the year 332 BC was from northern Syria south by the valley of the Orontes River to Damascus, and then along the Phoenician and Philistine coastline. So the Philistine coastline is essentially it's due west of Jerusalem and to the north, and then the Phoenicians are above that. The prophet foretold punishment against the land of Hadrach first. It has been identified, Hadrach has been identified as Hatarika, a city mentioned several times in the cuneiform inscriptions. It was between Hamath and Aleppo. For many years, we didn't know where that was, and there was a lot of speculation by Bible commentators. But now we have discovered that it was there between Hamath and Aleppo. Modern-day Aleppo is often in the news. The cities mentioned with it show its location must have been somewhere in the vicinity of Damascus. Though the stroke would fall upon Hadrach, its ultimate goal was really the capital city of Damascus. Native rule was never restored to this important city after its capture by Alexander the Great. The effect of Alexander's conquest on Israel and the surrounding nations was to be one of consternation and wonder. Their eyes would be turned to the Lord. And it says in verse 1, the word of the Lord is against the land of Hadrach and will rest upon Damascus, for the eyes of men and all the tribes of Israel are on the Lord. God did this that Israel might look to God. And so we come to verse 2b, Tyre and Sidon, and then into verse 3. And with Syria subdued, Alexander pressed his campaign southward to the cities of Phoenicia. Tyre is mentioned as more important, the more important of the two cities, for it had outstripped the older city of Sidon. It was to be taken in 332 BC, though they thought themselves to be very wise in their own sight. The NIV uses the word skillful. Tyrians were famous for their worldly wisdom. We read about it in Ezekiel 28, 3 and 4, 5, 12, 17. A bunch of verses in Ezekiel 28. The wisdom of the successful merchant had carried over into its diplomacy as well. Verse 3 here shows us how they displayed their worldly wisdom. They fortified themselves to the best of their themselves to the best of their ability, and accumulated silver and gold and became wealthy. Tyre was the center of Phoenician commerce and wealth. The word stronghold in verse 3, Tyre has built herself a stronghold. It forms in the original Hebrew a play on words with the name Tyre. Tyre actually means rock. The Assyrians besieged it unsuccessfully for 5 years. The Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar, 13 years, but they weren't able to conquer it. A pagan historian wrote that Tyre had the greatest confidence owing to her insular or island position and fortifications and the abundant stores she had prepared. So Tyre was on an island offshore and had stored up great provisions so that they could outlast great sieges against them. Though Alexander was the instrument God used for the doom of Tyre, he is declared as dispossessing her, smiting her wealth in the sea, and devouring her with fire. That's what it tells us here in verse 4. But the Lord will take away her possessions, destroy her power on the sea, consume her with fire. The people of the city were to be sent into exile. Alexander built a bridge of the ruins of the old city of Tyre from the mainland to the island, then besieged the island for 7 months. He captured it. He killed thousands of its residents, enslaved many, many others, and crucified still others, and then finally set the city on fire. Wealth, strong fortifications, and all were cast into the sea. No power can prosper apart from the living God. In verses 5 and 6, we turn our attention to Philistia. There were 5 cities, main cities of Philistia. They were the Pentapolis of the Philistines. Of the 5 Philistine cities, Gath alone is omitted from our list here, is not mentioned here. And it has been suggested that possibly Gath was more inland and not on the direct route of the army, or possibly even that Gath had been destroyed prior to this. Ascalon and Gaza would realize their helplessness to oppose the invader and would be struck with terror. Ascalon lost its population. Gaza was reduced after a siege of just a few months. Ekron, the farthest north of the Philistine cities and nearest to Tyre, had hoped that Tyre would successfully withstand Alexander on his way to Egypt, only to have that hope dashed to the ground with the unexpected fall of Tyre. Special mention is made by a contemporary of Alexander that the king of Gaza was brought alive to the conqueror after the city was taken. The king, he was a satrap or a petty king of the city, was bound to a chariot and dragged around the city to his death. Ashdod was to lose its native population during this invasion, being replaced by a mixed race of people. It was Alexander's normal policy to mingle different conquered people together. The loss of political independence, the splendor of their cities, the glory of their temples, even the worship of their individual gods would mean a crushing blow to the Philistine pride. That in which they trusted most and glorified in above all else was to be cut off from them by Alexander. In verse 7, I will take the blood of their mouths, the forbidden food from between their teeth. Those who are left will belong to our God and become leaders in Judah, and Ekron will be like the Jebusites. Now, Zechariah foretells the conversion to the Lord of the Philistines in the millennial reign of Christ. Zechariah looks ahead. He looks to an end time. The Philistines, will forsake their idolatrous ways and be a remnant unto God. Idolatrous sacrifices were eaten with the blood by the Philistines, which was forbidden by God for the people of Israel. The abominations or the forbidden food mentioned here are the things sacrificed to idols. Once cleansed from their idolatrous practices, they will be incorporated into the Jewish commonwealth as a leader in Judah, or as the Jebusites were. And so the Jebusites were the ancient inhabitants of Jerusalem who were incorporated into Israel, living with the people of Judah in the capital as equals and not as a conquered nation. You can read about that in Joshua 15 and verse 63. In verse 8, but I will defend my house against marauding forces. Never again will an oppressor overrun my people, for now I am keeping watch. During all this turmoil and strife in Syria, Phoenicia, and Philistia, God promises that he will camp among his people, encamp about his house to protect them from the army of the enemy, and he will keep his people under his watchful and persevering eye. The reference to my house here in our text has been understood in three different ways. Number one, possibly it's a reference to the temple. Number two, possibly it's a reference to all of the Holy Land. And number three, possibly it's a reference to the people of Israel, the house of Israel. In my opinion, the last is preferable, although in fact all of them are included here. And they all belong to this. Then, Zechariah, by the prophetic law of suggestion, passes immediately from the near future to the final deliverance in the far future, when Israel would be delivered from every oppressor. The city will be protected against its final enemies and their invasions. We are going to get to that in Zechariah chapter 12 and 14. We also can read about it in Isaiah 60 and Ezekiel 28. There is no safety comparable to that enjoyed under the gracious eye of a loving God. Now, in verses 9 through 17, the remainder of the chapter, the prophet turns his gaze now from contemplating the movements of the ruthless conqueror Alexander to view the person and work in humiliation and then in exaltation of the coming King of Israel, Messiah. Verse 9, rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and having salvation, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey. And so a donkey represented peace in the Old Testament. But Zion and Jerusalem are representing the whole nation here, are called upon to rejoice and exult in the coming of their glorious king. Nations trembled at the coming of Alexander, but the people of Israel are enjoined to rejoice greatly at the presence of King Messiah. For he comes not only to them, but for them, for their benefit, for their salvation. The word translated here, having salvation, righteous and having salvation, is literally saved or entrusted with salvation. He is bringing salvation. Having salvation means he is bringing it forth for the people. The righteous king works out a righteous salvation for his own people. His perfect work issues from his perfect person and purpose. The Grecian Alexander came to break down and destroy. Righteous Messiah comes to save and to redeem. The earthly king came with pomp and pride. The Lord from heaven came riding upon a lowly donkey, a colt. The riding upon a colt reveals lowliness of outward condition and inward disposition as well. He came in peace. The donkey, the colt, was the animal of peace. Genesis 49:11. All of this, as you know, is fulfilled in the triumphal entry of Jesus when he descended into Jerusalem riding upon the foal of a donkey. Verse 10, I will take away the chariots from Ephraim, the war horses from Jerusalem. The battle bow will be broken. He will proclaim peace to the nations. His rule will extend from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. Verse 9 covers the first coming of Messiah. Verse 10 indicates his purpose and accomplishments in his second coming. You see, Zechariah didn't see the valley that was between the first coming and the second coming. Rarely was that seen in the Old Testament among the prophets. Between these two verses, I guess I want to say this, between the two verses is the church age. But let's understand the church wasn't really recognized in the Old Testament. It wasn't wrote about. They didn't understand the church age in which we live. It was not foreseen by this prophet or the other prophets. When the lowly king comes again, he will inaugurate his rule by putting down all warfare and all strife on earth. The chariot, the horse, the battle bow represent all instruments of and weapons of warfare. Messiah removes these from his people and from all the nations on earth. No reliance is to be placed in those carnal instruments in that day. The way of peace is different in that day. Once these weapons are done away with, the Messiah speaks peace authoritatively to the nations. He commands it, and it's brought to pass. His word of authority accomplishes what man could never do, has never done, and will never be able to do by his own schemes. His kingdom of peace will extend throughout all the world. The reference here in sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth does not restrict it to the promised land. From other parallel scriptures, Psalm 72:8 and other parallel scriptures, we're driven to the conclusion that the reign of Messiah will be centered in the Holy Land and will extend to the ends of the earth. His will be a universal reign. Verse 11, as for you, because of the blood of my covenant with you, I will free your prisoners from the waterless pit. Zechariah passes from the contemplation of the glorious and peaceful reign of Messiah to another scene of conflict. He addresses Zion and promises that on the ground of the blood of her covenant, God would set free her prisoners from the waterless pit. What is the blood of the covenant? It's been suggested that the covenant referred to is the Mosaic, and it does speak of a time when God entered into covenant relationship with his people. That was a legal covenant, and Israel's failure in it caused the forfeiting of blessing. Perhaps the covenant referred to is the Abrahamic covenant, even more so in this verse, which applies beyond Israel to all the earth. The prisoners are those of Israel who are still in Babylon and have not returned under the permission of King Cyrus. Cisterns in Babylon without water were used as prisons. The prophet encourages the exiles before whom God has placed such promises and hope to return to the stronghold or to Zion, for he will abundantly bless them in place of their former distress. In spite of unpromising conditions, he's willing to do this for them even this very day. Verses 13 to 17 then refer to the conflicts and victories of the Maccabean age, when they were successful against Antiochus IV Epiphanes in the 2nd century. God's gracious protection is promised them. Judah is likened to the Lord's bow and Ephraim to his arrow. With these, he destroys the enemy. God's people are also compared to the sword of a mighty man that will be irresistible. This is fulfilled in the Maccabean Wars. God would appear on their behalf in mighty power. His lightnings, thunder, and whirlwinds of the south would aid them. It says in verse 14, then the Lord will appear and overthrow them. His arrow will flash like lightning. The sovereign Lord will sound the trumpet. He will march in the storms of the south. And the Lord Almighty will shield them. They will destroy and overcome with sling stones. They will drink and roar as with wine. In other words, they'll be filled with joy. Not intoxicated, but filled with joy. They'll be like a bowl used for sprinkling the corners of the altar. And then verse 16, the Lord, their God, will save them on that day as the flock of his people. They will sparkle in his land like jewels in a crown. How attractive and beautiful they will be. Grain will make the young men thrive, and new wine the young women. So 13 to 17 refers to the conflict victories of the Maccabean era, but in verse 16, their triumph would be a decisive one. And they would tread down their enemies as weak and contemptible sling stones. It says they will destroy and overcome with sling stones, showing the weakness of their enemy there. In the figure is seen also a vessel filled with blood of the enemy, as the horns of the altar and the sacrificial bowls of the temple were filled with blood. The ultimate benefit, verse 17, to Israel will be spiritual deliverance after physical victory. Israel will be the flock of the Lord, and as a glittering crown on his land. The prophet exclaims over the goodness, beauty, and prosperity which the Lord displays and views the people in a time of peaceful prosperity in the fulfillment of their messianic promises. And so that takes us to chapter 10. And chapter 10, obviously, is very closely connected with chapter 9. The blessings indicated in chapter 9, verse 17, how beautiful and attractive they will be. Grain will make the young men thrive, and new wine the young women. So we have these blessings that are prophesied, which will make the people to flourish and rejoice in the Lord. They will result from the people looking only unto God. The rain is to be prayed for, which will bring about the fulfillment of the bountiful increase of grain and new wine. The commandment to pray is not rhetorical, but it is literal, it's specific, it's emphatic toward those being introduced. But it's meant to impress upon them that the Lord will give them rain in answer to believing prayer. Verse 2, the idols speak deceit, diviners see visions that lie, they tell dreams that are false, they give comfort in vain. Therefore the people wander like sheep oppressed for the lack of a shepherd. Shepherd is a reference to royal leader or leadership. And so Israel has had the sad experience in the past of trying to achieve material prosperity by means disallowed by God. Israel resorted in her sin of idols and occultic practices to trusting them for blessings. The teraphim, the idols, the diviners, the dreamers, are a reference to household gods used for the purposes of divination, probably in the form of human beings. They were like the household gods of the Romans. They were kept at shrines, and the people even kept them in their private homes, worshiped them, and prayed to them. Verse 3, look, God says, my anger burns against the shepherds, and I will punish the leaders. For the Lord Almighty will care for his flock, the house of Judah, and make them like a proud horse in battle, or an invincible war horse in battle. How sad indeed was their lot to be without the aid of their rightful shepherds and without the voice of God through his prophets during the weary years of their dispersion. But those shepherds, rulers of God's people, who aided them in their idolatry and were leaders in it, were to know only the wrath, only the displeasure of God for so misleading his sheep, the people of Israel. The civil leaders are to blame in the people's departure from the Lord. These civil leaders are those of the nations around them who oppressed and persecuted the poor flock. God will visit these tyrants with his judgment, but will be gracious in his dealings with his flock. The figure of the sheep is then replaced by one of a horse richly equipped for battle. Such a horse is shown special grooming, special care. So Israel will be the special object of God's providential care. When she's in the place of obedience, there's no good thing which the Lord will withhold from her. The fulfillment of these things has not been seen yet. Not seen in the victories of the Maccabean Wars. These will be seen in the days of the rule of Messiah. And to this theme, the prophet now turns our gaze. The promise of Messiah is seen here in verse 4. From Judah will come the cornerstone. From him the tent peg. From him the battle bow. The cornerstone, the tent peg, the battle bow. Not from the foreign rulers spoken of will Messiah come, but from the house of Judah. The cornerstone, the battle bow, the peg are figures of the Messiah to represent his qualities of stability, dependability, strength. The cornerstone speaks of the ruler or leader on whom the building of government rests figuratively. It's a well-known symbol of Messiah in the Bible, the cornerstone. The nail, or the tent peg, could refer to a large peg in an Asian tent on which were hung many of the valuables. On the Messiah will rest the hope and trust of his people, or it could also refer to the tent peg that holds the tent in place to keep the wind from blowing it away, and the stability that comes from Messiah. The battle bow stands for all implements of war and might. Messiah is the great military commander of his people. He's the man of war. This will be clearly and openly manifest when he comes to rule in his millennial reign. A number of interpreters have seen a fourth designation here in this verse of Messiah in the role of ruler. I actually think that's based on a somewhat of a misinterpretation of the scripture, but even more so a misplacement of the verse marker. It seems to me that the every ruler belongs to verse 5. Every ruler will be like mighty men trampling the muddy streets in battle, because the Lord is with them. They will fight and overthrow the horsemen. I think it's looking at a negative side of these rulers, and a little bit different thought on that fourth possibility that is there. And so we come to verse 6. I will strengthen the house of Judah and save the house of Joseph. I will restore them, because I have compassion on them. They will be as though I have not rejected them, for I am the Lord their God, and I will answer them. Those who have been described before as sheep of the flock, then as a richly adorned horse, ready for battle, are now depicted as invincible warriors. They shall be empowered of the Lord to trample their enemies underfoot in the conflict. The Lord's presence with them will be in clear evidence. So Asian armies made much of cavalry. But these will not be able to stand against the onslaught of the people of God. And so I want to look back at this. It says in verse 4, at the very end of verse 4, every ruler, verse 5, will be like mighty men trampling the muddy streets. Because the Lord is with them, they will fight and overthrow the horsemen. I will strengthen, though. So a new day is coming. I will strengthen the house of Judah and save the house of Joseph. I'll restore them because I have compassion on them. And so the Lord was with the conquerors, but the Lord will be with Judah and Joseph, with all of Israel, have compassion, and they will be as though I had never rejected them. For I am the Lord their God, and I will answer them. The Ephraimites will become like mighty men, and their hearts will be glad as wine. Their children will see it and be joyful. Their hearts will rejoice in the Lord, and I will whistle for them, and they will come. So the house of Judah and the house of Joseph speak of the reunited nation. It's clear that a future return from exile after that of Babylon is being intended and predicted by the prophet here. Ephraim is now pointed out for blessing, for his exile had been longer than that of Judah. The northern kingdom carried away in 722 BC, the southern kingdom beginning in 605. So over 100 years longer had their exile been. Like Judah, Ephraim, or the northern kingdom, will experience the victory granted of God and will exult greatly as though enjoying a glass of wine. His children will experience and witness the God-given victory and will rejoice too. The joy of the Lord will be given to all of his people. So, as we have already seen, these manifestations of the power of God on their behalf presupposes their regathering and restoration to the land. This is now elaborated by the prophet. The Lord will whistle for his people. He will gather them, verse 8, and redeem them. They will be as numerous as before. Their regathering cannot be restricted to the 10 tribes because many of them were still in exile. For the regathering looks further into the future, I believe. It doesn't just look at the past. We're not looking at the past regathering here. There is another regathering that is going to come far into the future after a worldwide dispersing of the nation of Israel. Regathering, redemption, repopulation are all promised here. I believe that the prophet is foretelling more than a return from Assyrian and Babylonian exile. And it's definitely confirmed by the declaration of verse 9. In verse 9, though I scatter them among the people, yet in distant lands, they will remember me. They and their children will survive, and they will return. And so we seem to have far off lands, worldwide lands, and they will remember the Lord. Verse 10, I will bring them back from Egypt and gather them from Assyria. So both Egypt and Assyria represent this dispersion and captivity and bondage of the people of Israel. Upon return to the land, they will live both politically and spiritually. Their children will survive with them and enter into the good things prepared of the Lord for his people. Fathers, children alike will witness the restoration of the land. The areas from which they return are mentioned are Egypt and Assyria, but Egypt is mentioned as a typical oppressor of Israel, but was not actually a place where Israel was dispersed to. So we're looking at Israel as a place of slavery and a place of bondage, and Assyria as a place of exile. So we might read verse 10, I will bring them back from slavery and gather them from exile. I will bring them to Gilead and Lebanon, to the land of mountains and trees, and there will not be room enough for them. And so Egypt is an oppressor. Syria is an exiler, and just as the Lord went before them and parted the waters of the Red Sea, causing Israel to walk across on dry ground, so he's going to dry up every hindrance in the path of their restoration and return the land of promise to the people. The pride of Assyria will be abased. The land of Egypt will lose its own government. And so we conclude our chapter here. They will pass through the sea of trouble. The surging sea will be subdued. All the depths of the Nile will dry up. Assyria's pride will be brought down. Egypt's scepter will pass away. I will strengthen them in the Lord, and in his name they will walk. The prophets of the Old Testament are really united, declaring that the restoration of the people of Israel to their own land will be followed by their conversion to the Lord. I am so saddened today by replacement theology that somehow thinks the church takes the place and the blessing of Israel. That is false doctrine. It is false teaching. It is the lie of the devil. God longs for the return of his people. And Israel will one day return to the Lord and be converted. Not just return to the land, but be converted to the Lord. We're going to see in the next lecture that they will mourn the one they pierced. They will understand. So Zechariah concludes chapter 10 with a portrayal of their redemption and conduct. They'll be strengthened in the Lord in every spiritual need and will walk up and down in his name. The whole of their life and conduct will be permeated with a thought for the glory and honor of the Lord. They will live constantly under God's gracious and protecting hand. That's what Micah 4:5 told us as well. The promises of blessing in this chapter, which exist in the reign of Israel's king, are brought to a close with the record of Israel's redemption and her walk in agreement with his will and his character. This is the climax. It is the goal of prophecy in Israel. Happy is the people whose God is the Lord. Certainly we are living in wonderful, glorious days as we view Israel and the preview of the things God has predicted for her. The nation does live again, governmentally, politically, nationally, just not yet spiritually. They are returning by every mode of conveyance and in astonishingly great numbers. But there's more to come. This is not the fulfillment of the prophecies of the prophets of the Old Testament in the highest sense, not yet. They predicted spiritual life and conversion to God for the nation. God will never rest until this is accomplished. We need ever to be admonished that political prestige and recognition for Israel do not connote the blessing that God has intended for her. Israel must rest by faith in Messiah Jesus, the Lord, if she is to know the full purpose, promise, and blessing of God. And one day, indeed, she will. And so that takes us to our next chapter, and chapter 11. The predictions of chapter 11 were given probably long after the completion of the temple of Zerubbabel. The events themselves concern the most distant future from the standpoint of the prophet. The chapter is undoubtedly the darkest of Israel's history, and there has been much difference of opinion as to which desolation Zechariah has in mind in his highly poetic words at the beginning of this chapter in the first 3 verses. Let me read them. Open your doors, O Lebanon, so that fire may devour your cedars. By the way, the cedars of Lebanon is what they used to build the temple in Jerusalem and the royal palace. Wail, O pine tree, for the cedar is fallen. The stately trees are ruined. Wail, oaks of Bashan, east of Jordan. It's the land east of Jordan, in what was the half-tribe of Manasseh over there. The dense forest has been cut down. Listen to the wail of the shepherds or the rulers. Their rich pastures are destroyed. Listen to the roar of the lions, the leaders. The lush thicket of the Jordan is ruined. Events themselves concern the more distant future from the standpoint of the prophet. The chapter is undoubtedly the darkest in Israel's history. There's been a lot of difference of opinion on this, but the context of the rest of the chapter is determining, and it points unmistakably to the judgment which resulted from the rejection of the shepherd of Israel. And that destruction, the rejection of the shepherd of Israel, was the crucifixion of Jesus. The destruction that overtook the land occurred in AD 70 when Israel was destroyed by Rome and the temple was burned. And so, in verse 4, I read, "This is what the Lord my God says. Pasture the flock marked for slaughter." Verse 5, their buyers slaughter them and go unpunished. Those who sell them say, "Praise the Lord, I'm rich." Their own shepherds do not spare them. Verse 6, "For I will no longer have pity on the people of the land, declares the Lord. I will hand everyone over to his neighbor and his king. They will oppress the land, and I will not rescue them from their hands." So he begins really, and I'm going to come back to this in a second, but with the reason for the calamity, it's the rejection of Messiah, of their shepherd king. God cares for them. He calls them my flock. This is what the Lord my God says, pasture the flock. Those who sell is a reference to the Jews. The land, Palestine, not the whole earth. They will oppress the land is a reference to the Romans. And so then, and I'm just giving you a preview here, in verse 7, "So I pastured the flock," Zechariah actually role plays here. He acts this out before them and displays to them the message of God. So in Hebrew style, an effect is often stated first, and then the cause is presented afterwards. So it is right here. The cause of the judgment, the rejection of Messiah by Israel, is now elaborated on. The effect is in the first verses. Wail, weep. But here, the cause of the judgment, the rejection of Messiah, is being talked about. The charges to the prophet who performed the vision. He acted representatively for Messiah, in whose personal history these transactions took place. So Zechariah is role-playing. He is acting this out. "So I pastured the flock," marked, verse 7. It is actually a commission of the Son of God by the Father. The Messiah is given the task of feeding the flock for slaughter. He is to act as a shepherd to the flock who were yet to be slaughtered. They were doomed to be slaughtered by the Romans for their sin. We have the authority of the historian Josephus that tells us over 1 million, maybe 1.1 million, up to 1.5 million people perished. Israelites perished in 70 AD and round about that date in the war with Rome. The nation was in miserable condition, miserable enough condition when Christ came to them, but it was to get more and more miserable after Christ's crucifixion. They were sheep, bought and sold unfeelingly in the market. The reference is to all the oppressive measures under which they groaned while under foreign domination, especially under the Romans. These foreign oppressors had no scruples in the matter, for they thought they could continue without punishment. They hypocritically credited God for their gain in misusing the sheep. It was bad enough that Israel's own shepherds had no pity on them. Their own unprincipled leaders, the Pharisees and others, didn't even spare them. There was no man to espouse their cause or mitigate their sad plight. But the climax of the woe is reached when the Lord states, He will no longer pity the people of the land. Verse 6. The omniscient Messiah of Israel knew what the outcome of his ministry among the nations would be, and he faithfully undertook the ministry of the shepherd. Look at verse 7. So I pastured the flock marked for slaughter, particularly the oppressed of the flock. Then I took 2 staffs, called one favor, called the other union, and I pastured the flock. Wow, it's noted that he fed the flock. The prophet himself is carrying out the vision, acting out the vision of the transactions which the Messiah would experience in his earthly ministry in the fullness of time. When he fed the flock, he was feeding the poor and the humble of the flock. He says, in particular, the oppressed of the flock. But he fed them all for the sake of the remnant among them. Throughout the passage, these are distinguished from the mass of the nation. The remnant is distinguished. 2 staves were taken because the shepherd in the east carried a staff to protect against wild animals, and another one to help the sheep in difficult and dangerous places. So one was a weapon, one was a tool. The names given to them in this instance indicate the purpose of God intended for Israel in the shepherd ministry of Messiah. The first is called in the Hebrew beauty or favor or graciousness. My Bible translates it favor. The second is called in the Hebrew bands or bonds or binders, or union is the word that's used in my Bible. The first indicated God's restraint on the nations from destroying the nation Israel. The second had reference to the brotherly ties within the nation itself. And so we have favor and union. In other words, by the work of Messiah, the Lord meant to preserve for Israel his overruling providences among the nations of the earth, whereby they could not and would not work his people harm. By that same benevolent oversight, the brotherly bonds of the nation were to be confirmed and strengthened. Verse 8, in 1 month I got rid of the 3 shepherds. The flock detested me, and I grew weary of them. We are not left long in doubt as to the results of the shepherd ministry that Zechariah took on. In 1 month, in a comparatively very short period of time, the shepherd found it necessary to cut off the 3 shepherds over the nation. The soul of the shepherd wearied of them, and their soul hated him. They were weary of Zechariah, and they hated him for what he was doing, for the message he was given. Now, what's interesting is that we have a reference to in 1 month getting rid of 3 shepherds. 40 different interpretations have been counted concerning the meaning of the 3 different shepherds. What are the 3 shepherds? Now I'm going to tell you, if there are 40 different interpretations in the commentaries and books written on this, and through the ages, biblical scholars have studied this, contemplated, read, researched. If they have not been able to come to an opinion, why would I think that I could at least be certain that my opinion is right? And so I'm going to offer my opinion, but it's not a hill that I'm going to die on necessarily. I think that the 3 shepherds that Zechariah disposed of were 3 classes of leaders in Israel: the prophet, the priest, and the king. There was mutual disgust because they rejected his grace and favor. And so he sets them aside. And there is no more Old Testament prophet. There is no more Old Testament priest. And there is no more Old Testament king. It may be symbolic language like that he is using. But in verse 9 it says, I will not be your shepherd. Let the dying die and perishing perish. Let those who are left eat each other's flesh. Wow, there's mutual disgust. They don't like him. He doesn't like them. Because they rejected his grace and favor. We have the language of one whose patience is finally exhausted. Zechariah throws up his hands. When every means of grace has failed to draw them, Messiah gives over the nation to its own sinful way. Remember, Zechariah is acting out the role of Messiah. And in Messiah, prophet, priest, and king are set aside. And he is the fulfillment of all three of those roles. And so the Messiah gives the nation over to its sinful ways. The sheep which are dying of pestilence and famine will die. Those of the flock that are to be cut off by war and bloodshed will be cut off. And the rest will be given over to continuous internal conflict. Light rejected always brings greater night. Verses 10 and 11, Then I took my staff, called favor, and I broke it, revoking the covenant I had made with all the nations. It was revoked on that day, and so the afflicted of the flock who were watching me knew it was the word of the Lord. In order to symbolize the severing of certain relationships, Messiah breaks his staff, called favor or beauty, made with the nations. This indicated the breaking up of the covenant which God had made with all peoples. The peoples spoken of here are not the tribes of Israel. They are the people of all the world. The action is soon going to be duplicated in the breaking of the second staff, which does relate to internal conditions in the nation of Israel itself. Zechariah is speaking of the nations of the earth, and he reveals an important truth. God has made a covenant with the peoples of the earth relative to his own people, Israel. He has placed them under restraint, lest they work Israel harm or ill. When the restraint was removed, the Romans destroyed the city and the economy of Jerusalem and all Israel. Neither Alexander the Great, nor Antiochus the Fourth Epiphanes, nor Pompey was allowed to mar their national existence. But when Messiah broke his staff, neither Titus nor his generals could spare Israel nor the temple. Verses 12 and 13, I told them, if you think it best, give me my pay, but if not, keep it. So they paid me 30 pieces of silver, and the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter. The handsome, or trifling price at which they priced me. So I took the 30 pieces of silver and threw them into the house of the Lord, to the potter. Wow, we have a picture here of Judas and his betrayal and the 30 pieces of silver. Taking it back, throwing it at the high priest, at the Sanhedrin, and then that money being used to buy a potter's field. You see, in order to bring to a focal point the condition of the people spiritually, Messiah, and remember, Zechariah is still acting out the part of Messiah here. Messiah asked the nation to give him his hire or wages for his labors among them. So I told them, if you think it best, give me my pay, but if not, keep it. So Messiah is saying, what am I worth to you? Whatever I'm worth to you, give it to me. And if I'm worth nothing to you, then don't give me anything. Wow, the Messiah asked the nation to give him his hire or wages for his labors among them. What's the wage Messiah expected, or wanted, I should say? to be loved, to be obeyed, to be worshiped, to become their devoted God and Savior. But not by compulsion. Because if they were that minded, they could refrain from any manifestation of their evaluation of his ministry. And so they gave him 30 pieces of silver or money for his wage. Now, the interesting thing about 30 pieces of silver is that that was the price that you paid the master for killing one of his slaves. If you look at Exodus 21:32, you see that 30 pieces of silver was the price given to the master or the owner of a slave if your ox accidentally gored him. And so 30 pieces of silver was the price of a gored slave. Wow. They killed Messiah. And they paid 30 pieces of silver. Think of the insult. They placed Messiah on the level of a worthless, dead slave. How will God receive this base ingratitude? Well, the prophet is commanded to cast the sum to the potter in the house of the Lord. This is God's estimate of their evaluation of his son. The potter's field. Wow. So they paid 30 pieces of silver, and the Lord said to me, throw it to the potter. We don't really understand a potter's field today. But in ancient times, pottery was essential. You used it to cook, to carry water, to serve wine, to eat meals. It was essential to your life. And so the potter would take his clay, and he was the pottery maker for the village or the town. But sometimes oftentimes a piece of clay, would not yield to the master's hand. It would not allow itself to be formed, fashioned, molded, and made. It would break, it would distort. And so the potter would take that worthless clay, and there was a field designated as basically his dump. And so, because the potter threw all of his outcastings there, soon it did become the dump of the village or the town or the city. And then when poor people who could not afford to be buried properly would die, they would dig a hole for them in the dump, in the potter's field. So in the New Testament, when we read that they took the money that Judas returned and bought it as a graveyard for the poor, we've got to understand they paid a very small amount of money for a piece of land nobody wanted. There was nothing more than a dump where they could just literally throw out the bodies of the poor and the outcast and the neglected. What a sad, sad story that is. And then to make, to continue on here, the difficulty, one of the difficulties that we have, to make matters worse, I guess I'm going to say, with our passage is that this passage is quoted in Matthew 27, 7-10. Now, if you look that up, you'll see that it is a direct reference to Zechariah, except that in Matthew 27, 7-10, it quotes that as a reference to Jeremiah. So what do we do with a quote that's accurate quote in the Bible, but the wrong source is being given? How could the Holy Spirit make that kind of a mistake if all Scripture is inspired by God? Well, let me suggest to you that there's a difference between how we look at our English Bible and how the Jewish people looked at the Hebrew Bible. In our Bibles, the prophets begin with the major prophets, and Isaiah is the first one that is listed. Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Daniel, and then we go into the minor prophets. In the Hebrew Bible, Jeremiah is the first prophet recorded in their collection. And so it's very possible, and we have this, by the way, from extra biblical writings. It's probable that they often referred to the whole grouping of the prophets as the words of Jeremiah. It's kind of, I guess they use the word Jeremiah kind of like all of the prophets. Like they would refer to Ephraim as the northern kingdom, all 10 of the tribes, or Joseph as all 10 of the tribes. And so I think that's the solution to the problem here, that because Jeremiah's prophecy was placed first, they referred to, and we have evidence of it, the Jewish writings referring to Jeremiah, the writings of Jeremiah, as a reference to all of the prophets. Now, the prophet acts out the final severing of shepherds' relations with Israel in verse 14. Then I broke my second staff called union, and breaking the brotherhood between Judah and Israel. So this is certainly a reference to the disillusionment of between Judah and Israel, or of the people of God. And it was fulfilled. When we think of the disillusionment, we think all the way back to the splitting of the kingdom. But no, this is not a reference to that. This is a reference to the splitting apart of all of the people of God. And it was fulfilled in the sad scenes during the siege of Jerusalem by the Romans under Titus. There was a breaking up of the social fabric of the Jewish nation. It was an internal strife, and divisions were prevalent and contributed largely to the downfall of Judea and the dispersing of Jews all over the earth. That's what is in reference here. And then verses 15 to 17 close out our chapter. Then the Lord said to me, take again the equipment of a foolish shepherd, for I am going to raise up a shepherd over the land who will not care for the lost, or seek the young, or heal the injured, or feed the healthy, but will eat the meat of the choice sheep, tearing off their hooves. Woe to the worthless shepherd who deserts the flock. May the sword strike his arm and his right eye. May his arm be completely withered, his right eye totally blinded. And so the sad rejection of Messiah has been accomplished. But what is the outlook for the future? That's what Zechariah is now doing. We know how God scattered his people throughout all the world at that time. When he begins again to deal with them, it will be when? After the manner spoken of in verses 15 to 17. Verse 14 is the breaking of the staff called union, the separation of the people all over the earth. When the people come back, what's going to happen to them is now described in verses 15, 16, and 17. Since they would not have the good shepherd that they rejected, they will one day have a foolish shepherd, a bad shepherd. This one has been taken by some to mean all the ungodly rulers in Israel between Zechariah's time and the fall of the Jewish nation. Herod the Great, Ptolemy the Fourth. But I think the one spoken of as the foolish and worthless shepherd is undoubtedly Antichrist. The prophet is told to take the instruments of such a shepherd. They're the same as those of the true shepherd. The condition of heart makes the difference. The shepherd is a wicked one. Wickedness is represented in Scripture under the figure of folly or foolishness or worthlessness. In the Old Testament, foolishness and worthlessness implies moral lack and moral failure. The Lord allows him full sway, and he neglects the sheep and cruelly mistreats them. He has no heart for the sheep. He doesn't care about them. He doesn't care about the people. His greed is his ruling passion, his ruling power. That is the way of Antichrist. The judgment of God will rest upon this wicked one. His arm, a symbol of power, will be withered because he cared not for the sheep. And his eye, a symbol of intelligence, will be darkened, for he did not look after the sheep. God's judgment on him will be swift and sure. And so that brings us finally to the last 3 chapters of the Bible, when we see, in the most part, the second coming of Jesus. What a glorious ending this is to, I think, just the most glorious prophet among all of the minor prophets. I'll see you soon as we turn to Zechariah 12, 13, and 14.